Hello. I want to talk about Grameen Bank and what we can learn from their experience. Grameen Bank has been a very, very powerful institution in its own right. Today, it serves over 8 million customers in Bangladesh. But more than that, Grameen Bank has been the inspiration for really the entire microfinance movement. There were other pioneers, but no founders, no pioneers were as public and as articulate as Muhammad Yunus. So today I want to go back to the 1980s and then the 1990s to see what was so exciting about Grameen and to see what we can learn looking back at their experience. Grameen Bank showed that microfinance could be very attractive for donors. Grameen Bank established that poor customers, poor women in remote villages even, could be bankable, that they only wanted small-sized loans, and that hopefully that would increase their productive power and ultimately allow them to gain income that would reduce poverty and introduce a fundamentally new way of banking. Donors were attracted by this for a number of reasons. One, it's always appealing to help people help themselves. But there's also a more practical reason, which is that donors saw that they could help to start a bank like Grameen, and then eventually Grameen could become profitable, and then the donors could remove themselves. And so subsidies and grants were just meant to be temporary as they planted seeds in different places to start new microfinance institutions or to build in new areas. So the idea of microfinance was always very commercial as an ultimate goal, but there was always a place for subsidy to get things going. So it's helpful to look back on the real experience of Grameen Bank, because one of the powerful claims that Muhammad Yunus and others made was that while Grameen was growing and expanding and serving millions of poor women in Bangladesh, they were also making profits. Not huge profits, but profits nonetheless. And in fact, if one looks at the crucial period from when they started as a real bank in the middle 80s, in the 1980s, to a period in the middle 1990s, Grameen claimed that over that period, in fact, they had earned profits summing to 1.5 million US dollars. That's very impressive given the kinds of places they were working. I was curious about this claim because it's so important as a part of the narrative and part of the appeal of microfinance. So I wanted to go back to the data and really understand how Grameen had done that. Now, counting profit should be simple. Profit is just simply revenues minus costs. But when we look at a microfinance institution, it turns out not to be so simple. What are revenues? What are costs? Especially for an institution which is receiving subsidy. And so when we looked at this, we went back to revenues. Now first, revenues, the obvious source of revenues is that as a lender, you're making loans and you're receiving interest back from your borrowers. So that's the most important source of revenue. But it turned out that Grameen Bank was also including grants from donors as part of their revenue. Now that certainly was part of their income, as part of what made them work, but it wasn't part of their commercial enterprise. So if we want to really understand the profitability of Grameen Bank, we need to remove those grants to see what they were really just earning from their lending business. So that step removes about $16 million worth of what they counted as profit, or what they counted as revenue. Now, that's the revenue side. But what about costs? So it's also a little unclear. One step in calculating costs for a bank involves making provisions for loan losses. The banks make loans. Not all of the loans will be repaid. Almost all will be repaid, but not all of them. So a bank has to account for that when they calculate their profits and their losses. It turned out that Grameen Bank was not being very standard, was not using standard accounting methods to do that provisioning, to make those accommodations. Grameen was setting aside money for assuming about a 1% loan loss rate, whereas in fact about 5 or 6% of the loans were not being repaid after 2 years. So by my calculations, that was another $20 to $40 million that was not being properly accounted for. And those also have to be added to costs. And then the last component has to do with the costs of capital. Now, most banks that you know, they probably take savings and they pay the depositors an interest rate, and those are the costs of capital. They use that capital, those savings, to then lend to other people. But Grameen Bank, like most other microfinance institutions, instead borrowed money from outside and lent that to poor people in villages in Bangladesh. A lot of the money came from donors. And when the money came from donors, they did charge an interest on those outside loans. But the interest that was charged was very low. It was very low relative to the true commercial value of that money. So there's an indirect subsidy also involved in the cost of capital. This turns out to be a big thing. Grameen, on average, was charging about 2 or 3% for its interest on the money they were borrowing from outside. My calculation, and the calculation of other experts, is that they should have been paying about 10 to 15% as interest on that money. What that means is there was an indirect subsidy of about $81 million coming through those outside loans, and another $47 million coming through an equivalent calculation having to do with their assets or equity. So putting it all together, Grameen reported profits of about $1.5 million. But once we do all of these adjustments, we see in fact there was a subsidy, not a profit, a subsidy of about $175 million over this period, 1985 to 1996. So that subsidy is about 11 cents for every dollar lent. So about 11% of their loan portfolio was covered by subsidy. Now, there's nothing wrong with subsidy. The purpose of this exercise was not to criticize Grameen Bank, not at all. Grameen Bank has done inspirational things in very difficult environments. The point of the exercise is to be transparent about the use of money. Much of the subsidy is hard to see. It's indirect. It's coming through these soft loans and soft equity. This subsidy, I think in many ways, is a very good thing. It permitted the growth of a world-changing institution. It inspired a global movement. And Grameen is certainly not alone in using subsidy. So there's nothing wrong with subsidy. But we need to have an open and transparent conversation about how to use subsidy and how important it has been in creating the microfinance movement.